know I'm small, but not that small. Right. I don't know if there are any historians amongst you, but you will know that when you approach the study of history, you're not just simply looking at the past or a sequence of events. You're not just simply arbitrarily choosing to look at this particular period in time as opposed to another historical scale. There's something behind every choice that we make about history. For example, if you look at the last 300–400 years, people have at certain times chosen to look at universal history, the rise and fall of civilizations. Sometimes they have chosen to look at national histories or the history of revolutions. And we always have very big debates about it. There's constant debates about what is the appropriate kind of history that we're ought to be opting for. And what these debates are really all about are not simply historiographical questions. They're not just simply questions that are about sort of the integrity of the historical subject. They really are about an attempt to give meaning to life here in the present through the use of historical material. So for example, in England today, we're having a big debate about the curriculum that children should use in history. And the government has decided, or at least announced, initially a couple of years ago, that they're going to opt for national history. It's going to be a story of English history, the nation's history. And what's very interesting is that the minute that was announced, there was this huge, virtually everybody I know, every intellectual I know in every university, so this is absolutely horrible. How can you possibly want to have a history of your own nation? This is chauvinistic, nationalistic, this is too patriotic. We ought to be looking at the whole of the world. We ought to be looking at Africa, Asia, Antarctica, the environment, every single bit of history. And outwardly, this really sounds like a very progressive reaction. Why just bother with this teeny little nation when in fact there's all this other stuff to look at? And poor old Michael Gove was kind of denounced, and he said, no, I absolutely want to make sure that our children learn this nation's history. Now, a couple of weeks ago, the curriculum has been published, and all of a sudden that you realize that what you've got is not what I call national history, not the island story, but the, a kind of a slightly Tory version of the Labour crap that used to exist, where you get bits of modules of history, all kind of thrown together. I don't know if you studied history recently, you very rarely begin with the beginning and continue on. You get, maybe a half a term on the Industrial Revolution, and then you quickly jump back to the Norman invasion, and probably the only thing that's constant is that somewhere along the line, in your 3–4 years of history, you'll do a bit on the Holocaust. That's mandatory. You've got to learn about Hitler and Stalin, and then when you graduate, and you can even do an A-level in history, you actually have no idea, why the Tudors, became the Tudors, what happened in the War of Roses, very little about the Civil War, absolutely no continuity, and that's more or less what's happening. The question you need to ask, well, why is it that Michael Gove, who presumably meant what he said, that he wanted to stand up for national history, entered in a curriculum that is, in all but name, the same as New Labour's sort of curriculum. No real change. It's not as Philistine as the Labour one, but it's on par, where you literally end up comparing, you have a chance to compare Attila the Hun, Johnny Rotten of the Punks, and you can sort of various other characters, take it out of time, to kind of empathize with them and discover it yourself through that. That's the curriculum. And of course, the reason for that is not because it's particularly difficult to write a textbook. I could write, if you give me, a couple of months, I could write you a text of English history. Not a difficult task. It's because in British society, neither the conservatives nor their critics are able to give genuine meaning to the experience of England. It is not something that resonates with their imagination. It's not something that they can speak to. You know, they don't particularly feel that it means, even if it means something, they haven't got the intellectual vocabulary through which that can be expressed. You know, the debate about England was extremely, and English history was extremely narrow. And I thought that it was, you know, it was really quite interesting, you know, sort of that there is this inability to say that. And it's interesting that if you look at the statement that was made by Richard Evans, who is the Regius Professor of History at Cambridge. Now, talk about Regius Professor in Cambridge, that is about as English and as patriotic and as royal as you can be. I mean, that is really heavy stuff. He's a, you know, the very fact that it's called Regius rather than king, you know, they still use a bit of Latin there, which is ever so unpolitically correct. You know, in Latin it should really be abolished altogether. So he says, he explains the way, you know, his own estrangement from his own tradition, when he says he celebrates the new curriculum. He was critical of Gove to begin with, but then he finally realizes that Michael Gove has seen the light, has seen the way, and he said, the new curriculum is great because it recognizes that children are not empty vessels to be filled with patriotic myths. So instead of filling their little brains with patriotic myths, we'll just fill them with crap. That's basically, you know, so it's still the children. The idea is that it's still the children, you know, with the empty vessels. And I think what's interesting is if you look at the last 30 years, and if you study history, you'll find that what all the new trends in history have in common, all the important innovations in history, is that this real difficulty in giving real meaning to historical experience. Now, in the context of history, the giving of meaning to historical experience involves also a capacity, and it's principally about the capacity of giving meaning to causality. Causality and meaning are, you know, really closely implicated with one another. And when we talk about causality, we don't mean causality like in nature, where chemical processes, you know, sort of have certain inevitable consequences, but to understand how causality works. Now, what's happened is that since the 70s, almost all the conventions of both the left and the right have kind of disintegrated. So left-wing history, which used to celebrate revolutions, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the peasant revolutions, you know, that kind of stuff, that has been totally corroded. Because of not because the history was bad, not because the books themselves had some fault to them, but because if people stop believing in revolutions because they see what's happened in the Soviet Union or in Kampuchea or in China, then they will then say, well, were we also wrong about the French Revolution? Did we not emphasize, exaggerate the significance of the, you know, of the Puritan contribution to the Civil War and the social aspect of the Revolution of Reveal? Wasn't that wrong as well? And you go back and, from a left-wing point of view, virtually everything that you believed in, you know, sort of is now interpreted in a very negative light. I mean, the best example, I know this, and I feel this personally, because I grew up on the historiography of the French Revolution, and I just love reading Soboul and all these, you know, great histories. Whereas now, when you look at the crop of history of the French Revolution since Frank Furedi in the 70s, the French Revolution is now presented as the precursor of totalitarianism. The Gulag is already implicit in the taking of the Bastille. That's the kind of connections you make to that. And therefore, most studies of the French Revolution are really about not the optimism, the idealism that was driving it. In the new versions, it's a really mean-spirited individuals who are manipulating the people and lying and everything else. So, you know, all what would have been said as the more utopian, the more future-oriented bit of the French Revolution has been taken out. And that's the case with the Civil War. You know, 70s Civil War interpretation, very conservative. it really was basically a civil war between competing aristocratic interests. They were at, but there really was very little to do with ideas or about popular culture. All those things are really quite marginal. Just on that, I mean, the way you do it, and this is something, especially those who are studying history, should always remember, the way you can turn a radical moment into a boring, banal moment is by changing the scale. And one of the ways you change the scale is by introducing local history, right? Or you introduce regional history. And the more you narrow the scale, of course, the more individual interest, personal interest, do make sense. I mean, I always like to use the example of Ireland, where the whole Irish Civil War, the whole rebellion against England, has essentially been turned into a history of people stealing cattle from each other and arguing about who has what bit of land, Irish landlords, and people wanting, are aspiring to each other's possession. Now, of course, within revolutions, as you know, all these horrible things will go on. I mean, people are just as selfish in the middle of it, and people are looking at other people's land. But that doesn't mean that the big things aren't occurring. The more you narrow the scale, the more you see the blemishes. I mean, if you see a picture of me, that's kind of 200 yards away. I probably look not bad. Quite a nice looking person. But as you come near me, right? The closer you come, the more you see the pimples on my face, the blemishes on my skin, my buck teeth, everything else.
Cheer up, Frank.
That's precisely the point. You don't get a very cheerful history. And that's what's been happening on the left hand. On the right side, something very similar has happened, because imagine if your parents went to a good school in the past and you kind of grew up on sort of on the traditions of the empire. You kind of are extremely proud of what has happened in the Second World War, that England had actually stood up and been held firm, and you had the Blitz spirit and all the rest of that. You got this, I mean, it must be really nice to be like a product of that kind of confidence and sort of belief and everything else. And all of a sudden, everything that your grandparents stood for is called into question. It's now rubbish. The empire was an unmitigated story of exploitation and oppression and domination. Everything that England ever did in Asia and Africa was really a kind of form of slavery and plundering. You discover that the Second World War, it wasn't really a black and white story, because didn't the English and the British Air Force did to Hamburg, what Hitler did to the Jews in Auschwitz. And bit by bit, by the time you get to the very end of it, there is very little left of any of those patriotic ideals that he once stood for. So you therefore find that even traditional history is very defensive. And I've noticed it because quite often when I talk to teachers, English history teachers, I find myself in this really weird position where I'm defending English national history more than they do. I'm not even English, and I'm saying, well, look, at the very least, there is something there that is quite remarkable that this little nation has done. Don't you realize that? No, that's a myth, sort of, all those kind of things that I think. So what I'm really trying to get at is that we do have a situation where our historical debates, and the points that we're making are not driven by these incredible historical discoveries. That somehow we now understand that the best history is local history, and our scale was too big, any more than what people are now saying, that in fact the scale is going to be much bigger than ever before. So all these arguments about what scale of history that we need, how wide it should be, the lens with which you approach history, you have to understand as being founded upon certain sociological and cultural preconceptions that have got to do with the way that society negotiates causality, and particularly what I would call the classical causality, but I think Western societies are having a phenomenal problem in making sense of causes. We find it very difficult to deal with that very old philosophical problem. And more importantly, which is a moral problem, is the meaning issue. What is the meaning that we draw from the past? What are the lessons that we're able to sort of internalize for ourselves in the 21st century? And it seems to me that one of the things that has occurred more and more is that we've learned to criticize national history. I think national history has been fairly severely sort of undermined and criticized. And criticizing national history is perfectly all right, but other forms of history, which correspond to our disorientation with meaning and causality are acceptable. And I think that's the kind of history that you're now getting, a very contingent kind of history that has become ever so popular. And in particular, what I would like to talk about is what I think is probably the most regressive trend in history of all. If I had given this talk 20 years ago, I would have spent the lecture criticizing local history and regional history and cultural history. Where all of a sudden we discovered that Scotland has always been, sort of the most civilized part of the world, and suddenly we discovered that Cornwall has this very rich heritage of, of legacy. So that's what I would have criticized. But today, the focus of my attack is really big history. But that's really the big new thing that's kind of happening within our kind of society. And I think in many ways, this development is far worse. The consequences that are far more destructive than any of the previous ones. You will have noticed that whether you're in Australia or in England or America or anywhere else, the critics of national history always call for big history, or they will call it cosmopolitan history, or they will talk about global history, or they will talk about world history. It's all about expanding the scale all the time. But not the geographical scale, that's one thing they want to expand, but also the time scale in which history is kind of situated. And as Harvard professor David Armitage argues, across the historical profession, the telescope, rather than the microscope, is increasingly the preferred instrument of examination. So basically, we're looking at really, really big pictures here. And the proponents of teaching big history draw this logic through their ever-widening approach of the topic of their investigations. The author of the syllabus, Big History, and you can go on the website and look at the Big History website, and it's an important initiative, and typically, whenever you have really crappy big initiatives, there's always one man who's behind it, Bill Gates. So he's the one that's financing it. He seems to have his hand in everything, kind of like that. The author of the syllabus, David Christian, contends that what it offers is a story that transcends the nation state and covers humanity as a whole. So that's quite promising. It covers humanity as a whole. And in the story it says, you encounter humans, not as Americans, or Germans, or Russians, or Nigerians, but as members of a single genetically homogeneous species, Homo sapiens. And I think the emphasis here is the genetically homogeneous. The genetically homogeneous. Interesting, because almost, sort of without saying so, in all but name, is subtly repost history from the human to the genetic material. That becomes the binding element. And I think that's not an accident, because in genetics and in biology, we're able to find causality and meaning, hope to find it, in the material world that is not really available to us in the human one. But of course, history is not just interested in humanity, even genetically homogeneous humanity. It's very proud of the fact that it covers species, all kinds of species. And in fact, the website on which this kind of sort of course is outlined boasts the fact that Homo sapiens are not even mentioned until halfway into the course. Right? So you ask the question, well, what are you learning the first half of the course in history? So what are you learning there? And basically what he's really getting at is that by reducing humanity to its biological essence and species, the whole question of civilization, culture, and community, which are and should be the core concerns of history, however you want to define those things, become relatively sort of insignificant. Now, outwardly, a lot of people who like big history say, well, Frank, why are you objecting to this? There's an old honorable tradition in history that has done this. So they point to the fact that there's always been what they call universal history. And it is true that there have been some very important writings in universal history. We have Oswald Spengler, on the decline and fall of the West. We have Arnold Toynbee, one of our own here in Britain. So there is this kind of big-scale history that is sometimes quite interesting, and that's been attempted over the past. But I would argue that big history, the way that it's written now, has got nothing in common with what used to be called universal history. A truly universal history, which I'm all in favor of, just as much as I like national history, I also like universal history. A truly universal history would have as its focus the significant human accomplishments that bind people together through different cultures. And rather than focusing on the biological or chemical makeup of species, a universal history would explore the different civilizations, how they evolved, how they interacted, how they developed, and how they kind of dealt with commonly shared global sort of issues and problems. But it seems to me that the big history project, insofar as it shares anything, it's not the civilization or the cultural with the human. It's really about something very, very different. And it seems to me that if we are going to veer away from the human, cultural, civilizational side, then we move into a domain which is entirely estranged, entirely alien from the universal history side. Francis Fukuyama, in his very bad but very interesting book, The End of History, quite rightly makes the point that universal history of mankind is not the same thing as the history of the universe. Universal history is not the same thing as the history of the universe. And he added, it is not an encyclopedic catalogue of everything that is known about humanity, but rather an attempt to find a meaningful pattern in the overall development of humanities and their societies in general. So universal history, the reason why people write it isn't because they just want to, they got a lot of spare time in their hands and they want to put everything down. It's because they're trying to find a common pattern. Are there some patterns that are truly universal in terms of our experience? Is there anything that we can point toward? Are there some laws, perhaps, that we can extrapolate and some meaning given to those laws through that whole process? I don't know if any of you came to my lecture on Hegel, but you might recall that if you did look at Hegel's philosophy of history, that is a paradigmatic piece of universal history. That's the universal history. And Hegel became probably the most influential 19th century theorist of universal history. He drew a very clear distinction between the past and history. The past and history are not the same thing. Something that happened a long time ago is something that happened a long time ago. That's not necessarily history. In his case, true history begins at a point where rationality begins to enter into worldly existence. He claimed that the point of departure in history is when it begins to be interpreted and recorded as history. He contends that history requires concepts of individuality, rights, and law, a universally binding directive, which in his case were institutionalized through the state. So with Hegel, the philosopher of history attempted to provide a philosophical historical argument the development of humanity's self-conscious awareness. Now, you may or may not agree with that, but at least there's an attempt on his part to see, to basically make a decision of what this conscious experience of human being really amounts to. Now, one thing, I don't know, are there any historians amongst you here? No, none of you are historians. But anyway, there's at least one, or 1.5. I think one of the questions you have to ask is that when you read a book on history, ask yourself the question: when do they begin? When do they think that history begins? Right? And that's an important question. The Bible begins in the Garden of Eden. You know that. Why? The question you need to ask. And I do that as a sociologist, not just as a historian. Why there rather than before? Hegel begins his history, sort of where at a point at which rationality, in terms of its human qualities, in terms of its experience from nature, begins to kick in. That's the cutoff point. Other people will have different starting points of where history sort of kind of begins. It's really very important. That's why do they begin when they begin? Because in the choice that we make in the point of departure, we're saying something really very important. Right? We're making a very important statement, which is as relevant to our own concerns in the here and now, the past. Because the reason why we choose a particular point isn't because we were there, we saw it, and we recorded it, but because we now, in the 21st century, think that is an important sort of point of departure. Now, in contrast to Hegel, big history, an orientation promoted by the International Big History Association, it is big. It's like a big American, sort of fast food hamburger. It is big. It's an influential movement, and of course, I said it's supported by the chairman of Microsoft. Their version of history stretches back to Big Bang itself. I mean, Big Bang is like their Garden of Eden. Sort of that's really when things really begin to kick in. So this so-called universal history is coterminous with the universe itself, and that's what's interesting about it. And if you look at their website, it says it claims to provide a synthesis of virtually everything there is to know. That's what it said. So it looks at everything that there is to know, and we kind of put it together for you, in a kind of big history, kind of bite-sized kind of a way. And it's based on the evidence of cosmology, astronomy, geology, evolutionary biology, archaeology, environmental science. They all make their appearance. And this is a history that is self-consciously sort of distanced from the conceptual distinction between nature and culture. And that was always one of the big distinctions in history. Nature, that's natural history, that is a very different dynamic and logic to it than cultural or human history. So that distinction between the natural and the cultural is somehow totally sort of destroyed. It also destroys the distinctions between the material and the spiritual. You almost think that rocks can pray as much as human beings, that there's no real difference between them, and between the human and the non-human. On the website it states, I quote, "Big history seeks to understand the integrated history of the cosmos, Earth, life, and humanity using the best available empirical evidence." I love that expression, the best available. Sounds like somebody out of the government, the best available evidence, a good practice, available. And it goes on to assert that, and this is what, and I quote this, beginning about 13.8 billion years, the story of the past is a coherent record that includes a series of great thresholds. Beginning with the Big Bang, big history is an evidence-based account. I love this evidence-based. I can see Bill Gates kind of checking out the Big Bang, because the evidence-based account of emergent complexity with simpler components combining into new units with new properties and greater energy flows. That's what that is. And basically, the distinct claim of this syllabus is that it is big and purports to encompass everything. Now, big history, I mean, this is something that those of you that are in business will understand. Whenever you go to one of these leadership courses or managerial courses or whatever, somebody will immediately come along and have you heard of somebody say, we live in an ever-growing, rapidly changing world where everything is truly global and it's no longer what you have the usual sort of, and you have so much information out there, that these days a 4-year-old child idiot in their little kind of sort of PlayStation game has got more information than geniuses in Oxford University 200 years ago, blah blah blah, and therefore everything that we knew in the past is really the past. Same old. We need to have something very different. It's a completely, I mean, the talk has got this kind of persuasive inner dynamic, but it's totally shallow and totally empty. Right? As if somehow the world didn't change in the past. Somehow in this period of stasis for the last 16 billion or 8 years, there's all this stagnance, but this has really changed. But of course, when you look at what's offered, it's really a melange of everything that has occurred in time and space, which is then organized according to a naturalistic theological model of evolution. And although it relies on rhetoric drawn from evolutionary biology, geology, environmentalism, cosmology, its historiographical approach bears an uncanny resemblance to medieval theological history. If you strip it bare, it is all medieval theological history, but turned around. Because if you look at the old Aristotelian propositions on which it was based, you begin with the rock, and you kind of gradually end up to the spirit, so we kind of turn that around. We begin with human consciousness, but we prefer to see history as moving towards the material, totally sort of naturalized kind of conception. But also what's interesting is that this kind of history, like medieval history, relies entirely on a myth of origins. Right? It's, for all the best evidence and all the stuff of science and everything else, it's got that kind of really old-fashioned, non-empirical, faith-based approach, where what binds us together is this common origin. In the case of religion, the common origins was, our, sort of God's creation, or a particular version of that, origins, life beginning in the Garden of Eden or something like that. In this case, what you have is a history where a different myth of origin is pushed forward, which is the preferred myth for the 21st century. I'll read this out. Take a bit of time, but I think it will give you an idea of what I'm talking about. So in the syllabus it says, what we can conclude from our 13.82 billion year journey. I love that idea. Journey. Can you imagine, Big Bang occurs, a couple of rocks decide, well, that's really cool. It's really cool to travel to 21st century Britain, embarking on this journey. And there's not the slightest self-conscious reflection that you're making things up entirely. Anyway, we kind of embark on this 13.82 billion journey in this universe, and it says the access to high quality energy in certain pockets has permitted increased complexity in relationships between quarks, atoms, molecules, cells, animals, and humans within families, cities, nations, empires, and the world. Each of the earlier relationships, and imagine this is a relationship, quarks to atoms, let's go out. The quark calls up the atom. We'll have a date on Friday night. What are these relationships that we're kind of talking about? But anyways, each of these earlier relationships continue to be part of our current ones, although often in transformed ways. You and I are the beneficiaries of the relationships that have been developed. We are made from the relationships among quarks, atoms, molecules, cells, and many intricately related body parts. And then, John, you live now you're laughing at this, but this is taken totally seriously. This is people actually think that this is real, rigorous historical stuff. We live within kinship groups, nations, and empires. Many of us are connected with others around the world through almost instantaneous exchange of digital information. We have evidence for a common origin of all of us, and indeed everything in the universe. Interesting idea of origins. So the common origins of all of us, and indeed of everything in the universe. All of us on Earth have a common origin, and ultimately a common destiny. A common origin and a common, and I think this is a very significant statement, because if you strip bare what it's really saying, if you kind of get rid of the scientific language in terms of what it's trying to do, it is almost has a kind of quasi-religious kind of quality to it, but it cannot speak the language of theology. It hasn't got a spiritual inner drive. It cannot really, sort of talk the language of morality, and therefore it kind of self-consciously hides behind physical material sort of kind of property, and tries to, in other words, what it's really doing is it's able to give more meaning to a piece of rock or to an atom than to you and I in the way that we make our way within the world itself. That's really, it's a complete fetishization. It's turning relations to a fetish, in the genuine, sort of traditional, conventional sense of the word. So we have this relationship between physical things, which are coterminous with the relationship that we have with each other as family members. And therefore, by rendering the physical as relational, its premise becomes a claim to common origin. And of course, the common origin is nothing like the Roman story of Enid or the Garden of Eden. It becomes a matter, a history of matters. Now, you might argue, well, this is just one group of people, and it doesn't really represent very much. What's the point of going on about it? But if you look at some of the other schools of thought, there's a school of thought called deep history. I love that, deep history. And they use the word deep history as a way of making a self-conscious contrast to what they call shallow history. Shallow history is what I call history. It's really about, last 2-3 times a year. That's not really deep, man. And basically, deep history is also devoted to working up under the time scale that eradicates the relationship between history and prehistory. And indeed, it stretches back. It's a bit more modest. It's not really big. It's not big history. It only stretches back to the period, the years 500,000 years ago to 2.6 million years. So it's kind of, that's the time scale that it is working on. And in their manifesto, they wrote a manifesto called Deep History, the architecture of past and present. The authors complain about the fragmentation of historical time, that historians have fragmented historical time mainly by looking at human history. But of course, when they criticize shallow history, what they're really criticizing is the fact that history, as we understand it, over the last 200-300 years, was about human accomplishments. However, what's really at stake with deep history is not time scale, but the premise of historical orientation. And therefore, their attempt, like that of big history, is to shift the focus of history away from human-centered conceptualization, the one that represents material and natural processes as the key and interesting influences on the unfolding past. And therefore, from this perspective, what they criticize as anthropocentric history is really a history, a critique that basically suggests that what we should be really interested in is not so much what human beings do, because that's really relatively trivial. That only has a very short time space. What they think is really interesting is what happens to human beings. Next time I will.
About 4 minutes.
Okay. So from this point of view, history is really about earthquakes erupting. That is real history. And history is really about big bangs. History is about sort of volcanoes. They are really they are the ones that make history. And their own human beings under those circumstances are really as marginal extra bit layers. The point they all make, and in this sense, this is put forward most consistently by environmental history, or the planetary focus of environmental history, is that, of course, the more you go back in time, the less significant the role of human beings, the less significant role of culture. I mean, culture has got very little role to play 4 billion years ago. Right? There is no culture. There is no human culture. So, not particularly relevant to look at. Human culture, even sort of 500,000 years ago, it is not exactly a very interesting subject for investigation. I mean, nobody, as far as I know, has yet argued that human beings make history, in 400,000 years ago. That's not really what is happening. And the more you go back in time, the less control that humanity has over its circumstances. That's what environmental history really tries to tell us. The reason for that is because if you can, begin history as early as possible, then you can make a claim, and this is the central claim of environmental history, or big history, or deep history. The claim that you can make is that actually it's really arrogant for human beings to take themselves too seriously. It's really a conceit to imagine that humanity as a species matters very much, because the planet has been here, the universe has been here for billions and billions and billions of years, and most of that time there is no evidence of any human accomplishment. What's the big deal? Who cares about the human? Right? You might as well see that. And not only that, but the second conclusion that's drawn, and this is in many ways even worse, is not only are human beings insignificant and have got no progressive or distinct role to play, insofar as human beings have done anything in the world, since they've been involved in the making of history, since they've been culturally active, the role of human beings has been to have a negative impact on the environment. They've been undermining the environmental foundations of the planet. And instead of creating progress and socializing nature in a positive kind of way, they've been having an inherently negative, disruptive kind of consequence. Now, I call this kind of history, just to end on, the new conservative historiography. And it's interesting because this historiography criticizes what used to be called conservative history, national history. And I think what's very interesting is that all of these histories, the criticisms of the curriculum, that a national history, kind of country curriculum, the criticisms made of the role of humans by big history and deep history, all have one kind of aim in common. The history that they hate the most unpopular and the most unfashionable history at the moment is national history. The history that they all, and even those people who don't go as far as big history, but just merely want global world history, the history that they really dislike is national history. And my conclusion from this is this: the reason why they don't like national history isn't because of any kind of inherently important historiographical objections. The reason why they prefer global history to national history isn't because they're very internationalistic. They speak a lot of languages and they are truly globalized in their imagination. The reason why is this: in a world where we cannot really understand the relationship between human subjectivity and objective reality, where we cannot give meaning to human experience in terms of its history-related kind of processes, where the making of history is not something we seriously believe in, but the influence of human beings on their immediate circumstances is seen in very kind of shallow terms, then it's much easier to see humans in the global context than in a national context. Because you see, as citizens of the world, right, or as citizens of EU, the larger the scale, as citizens of this large scale, we have no influence. I mean, everybody knows that. I mean, as a global citizen, what does that mean other than a metaphor? You know, I mean, as a global citizen, who am I going to elect? You know, who can I hold to account globally? I mean, I even have a problem holding anybody in Europe to account, in the EU. Not exactly, I don't even know who my MEP is, never mind anything else. He certainly doesn't know who I am. You know, so the larger the scale, the less influence you and I have over the direction of that body that I'm looking at. Whereas for better or worse, for everything about the nation, you can be totally unpatriotic, you don't think very much of the nation. For better or worse, at least in the national context, you do have, at least potentially, the possibility of altering the direction of that particular unit. I mean, you might, as a very liberal person, prefer international NGOs, but they're great, they're wonderful volunteers. They're not as corrupt as our politicians are. But you can never directly influence the trajectory of that NGO. You know, if you don't elect them, they're not accountable to you. They do whatever they think is good for you. But at the very least, here in this country, if you don't like a member of parliament, if you think they're corrupt and politically inept, you do have at least potentially the possibility of getting rid of them. And I think it's this kind of agency element of you as an individual, your external circumstances, that is being eradicated by all these systems. And that is why. It's not the concern with patriotism, it's not the concern with the nation, but it's really the indifference and in the end the kind of estrangement from a human-centered conception, not just of the past, but far more importantly, of the present, in terms of what can be done in today's conditions.
Now we go out for questions, and there's quite a few. You at the back.
Right, thank you very much, Frank. It was a very, very interesting lecture you gave. As a historian myself, I find myself asking, if not local history, as you were arguing was the dominant trend 20 years ago or so, you were arguing against that. If not big history now, then what history? And I think it was kind of our answer that you said, environmental or different news, conservative historiography. But the point that I got from the lecture was that, I don't know if you can say, but I think that human beings have accomplished a lot in their history. I think we've done fairly, fairly unique things. We've gone from Neolithic primitive man through to the society we're living in now, where we interact with much more degree of decorum, much more respect and dignity towards our fellow man than in the past previously before. And although the chronology of our past may seem distant, may seem shrouded in mist, and it becomes mythic and it becomes legend, we shouldn't deny that there is no history there. Simply because it's so far back, we simply cannot understand and perceive it becomes more of an archaeological adventure rather than one history. So I would refute and perhaps criticize many of the conclusions you made. One of them being the national curriculum decision for state history. I mean, I'm not in favour of state history. I'm not in favour of what the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats believe to have. In fact, I'm in favour of no national curriculum existing whatsoever. I'm in favour of historians making up their own minds of how chronology flows and how you yourself can make up. History is forever being revised, is it not? When we go in the present, we look back and we understand our past from the way we perceive things, the way we see things. And who are you, and who is anyone to say, no, this is the way you should look at things. No matter if it's the government, no matter if it's you, we should take these opinions, these perceptions, but make your own decisions for what we ourselves think to be. And that's what I'd like to say.
Okay, thank you. Jim?
I thought with the growth thing, I thought his big problem in establishing a national history was kind of the recognition that, while on the one hand he wanted a meaningful account of history, which could give meaning to British identity, but at the same time he's not really very keen on British people, and therefore the thought of doing a development of this great nation, he kept looking out all the people who voted for him, who wanted a patriotic history, and thinking, I don't really like you guys very much. So I thought that was the confusion he got into more than anything else. I just thought there's something really kind of interesting in the idea that you presented of the kind of evacuation of the human subjective element from history. And the presentation or the attempt to give a kind of, therefore, objective, big history, history of everything, history which is of the world and the universe and everything else. Because the other thing that strikes me as the kind of reflection of that is the fact that it also entirely undermines and corrodes any sense of disciplinarity within history, and indeed conversely within any other discipline. So kind of one of the great sort of Kantian or Enlightenment developments in the progression of human knowledge, the idea that actually not just does the world have different components to it, but our approach to understanding the world has different disciplinary mechanisms of history and philosophy and different aspects within the natural sciences. What you're then presenting is the idea that the historian, or the big historian, then completely elides any distinction between biology and what biology teaches and how we approach biology, and archaeology and what archaeology teaches and how we approach archaeology, and history and what history teaches, and etc., etc., etc. So it's kind of the other side of what you're saying, which is that not just is the subjective progressive moment taken out, but in taking out that subjective element to the attempt to kind of describe history. You also actually take out the very vantage point from which history as a discipline actually made sense and created something meaningful as history as a discipline, as opposed to biology, which contributes something entirely different.
Okay, people can ask short questions.
Can you expand on the idea of causality a bit more? I know you talked about that in relation to Hegel yesterday, but I read that horrible book by Edward O. Wilson, Resilience, I can't even say the name of it. And it seems like they think they've nailed the causality problem through through brain science and the discussion of drive. I mean, they're obviously quite self-conscious about the causality issue because it's got problem solved through sort of social Darwinism in science. And his argument is we don't actually need social theory, historians, we can just dump all of that lot now because we've now got the basis on which we can develop a scientific understanding of human society and its origins.
Okay, I'll take one more bit and then get Frank to come back.
Given everything you said, and my reading, particularly of kind of environmental form of world history, I'm just wondering whether it's really worth critiquing it, given kind of how irrational it is. I mean, obviously, on the one hand, we do look at kind of big questions, but if we think about past more universal critiques, we think, for example, about Marx. Marx was at least critiquing the rational concepts of Smith and Ricardo to arrive at his universal theory. But when we look, for example, at the environmental world's histories, and thinking about John Diamond or Frank Furedi, just one illustration was, when Ponting argues that the preferable form of human society and hunter-gatherer societies, does that for many reasons, but one of its central reasons is because hunters and gatherers had so much time on their hands because they could sustain themselves from collecting berries, etc. Now that is a completely irrational concept because obviously they had no concept of time. So, they have no culture. So, given that level of rationality, is it really worth critiquing this form of world history directly? Or is it just better to kind of ignore it and focus much more on what you said in your initial lecture about looking at the universal and some sort of different civilizations and how we can kind of build on them?
But just on this question of causality, because that's really what everybody's talking about. the way that I understand causality is this. When I was very, very young, I'm still old enough to live in an age where when I went to school, and I went to school in Canada, and in the first year I learned the history of Canada. And the history of Canada began with the discovery of Canada by the Vikings, and I went through all the way to where I lived. So I knew Canada's story. I'm not saying it was a subtle history or great history, but at least there was something there that I could understand. And in the course of looking at Canada's history, I knew, sort of at least some of the signposts along the way. I might not have understood necessarily, why the Canada became English Canada from the French Canada, nor why, sort of Canadians decided not to join the United States. That was a different argument. At least I knew that those discussions were had. And so the second and third year, we learned British history. And we actually began British history, sort of, I think in a kind of in the pre-Norman period. Went through the Norman period. We went through the whole, sort of new, all the kings, Richard II, Henry, the War of the Roses, went through, and we actually have to know, we were in Canada, we have to know the name of every single English king. That was obligatory. And then, in my 5th and 6th year, we learned Roman and Greek history, so we kind of began with that. And when I came away from my history, and I went to a crappy state school in Canada, it wasn't like, Eton or anything like that. But by the time I kind of left, I had a sense of, what the causes were. Now, they might have been wrong, but I knew roughly what was going on. And when I talk to children today who go to schools, even very good schools in England, sort of, they literally have got no idea the relationship between the War of Roses, the impulse towards centralizing the English state under the Tudors, why the compromise between Parliament and monarchy broke down, and the civil wars kind of erupted, the restoration, the Georgian period, all of those things, is that an alien land to them. Now, why is this? Why have got? Some people argue it's because history has changed, because we're now much more interested in children learning the skills of history. So a lot of kids are learning how to interpret, history, use historical skills, and how to empathize, how to feel, how certain experiences occurred. So, children are told, imagine you're a peasant in Norman, times, and you got to write a lesson, draw a little drawing or something like that. Picture it, kind of fill in, color in pictures and that kind of thing. Now, a lot of that, of course, we all know is just kind of playing. But the people argue that this is important because it's far more important that children learn critical thinking, which what history gives them, than about the history itself. And I too think that thinking critically is not a bad thing. I also know that unless kids have got something to criticize, critical thinking becomes like a training exercise, the way you train your dogs. Fetch the stick glue. That's basically what's going on there. And what we call critical thinking and historical skills are actually fabricated, sort of manipulated, sort of accomplishments that are uncritical, because, sort of, and you know this because every child in England is told, and I think Scotland as well, when you prepare for a critical thinking historical exam, the words you've got to use is that there is no right and wrong, right? And given all these things, there's no one way of. So we are so critical, because teacher, I'm so critical because I know there is no right and wrong. 10 points for that, Bruno. So that's the way it is. And of course, the question I asked the sociologist, well, really, what has happened? Why has this really occurred? And my answer to that is that, and the reason why we have this kind of history is because we've lost the capacity to teach the meaning to an unfolding story. We lost the capacity to genuinely believe in causes, to explain phenomena in a way that corresponds to our own cultural experience. And that's why you have every old historical debate renewed. I mean, history always re-argues old points. But at least you know, when the cause of the First World War was debated, there would be different points. You know, you blame the Germans. You know, other people would blame, you know, sort of the Serbian anarchists. Others would blame, you know, sort of the French. And, you know, depending on your perspective, you have different explanations for the cause of the First World War. I used to blame, you know, I still do, the wars, the imperialist rearmament campaign, various kind of global dynamics that kind of set that in play. Today, when you read books on the First World War, the main explanation that they give for the First World War is that there is no explanation. There is no explanation. And you know, it's almost an entirely kind of contingent event. It just happened. That's more or less kind of what is being argued. There is no explanation. And the reason for that isn't because these historians are ever so subtle. That, you know, that this incredible evidence has emerged, which calls everything into question. It's because we find it difficult to give cause meaning. That's really what's going on. And just as we give difficulty in giving meaning to specific huge events, and we're doing that with the Second World War, we deconstructed the Second World War to the point at which the role of England in the war is kind of the moral equivalent to the Germans. And that's, you know, and that's not because we're, you know, pro-German or anything like that, but we just find it very difficult to kind of give meaning to it. And that's really what's really going on. And my position on national curriculum is this. I don't have very much time for national history or patriotic history. But I do think that children ought to have a history that they learn that's got a clear argument, so that at least they have a sense of unfolding stories, unfolding meanings. I don't care if it's right or wrong. I mean, I can live with history of kings, and I can live with kings of little people, you know, little peasants making their rule, as long as there's something. Because the way that children and young people and adults learn about history is not just by internalizing what the teachers tell them, but by rebelling against it. I remember when I went to school in Canada, we used to criticize the presentation of history. We react against it, but there's something to react against. How can you react against a module, you know, sort of a little bit of history here and there? How can you react against that? You don't react against anything, and therefore you don't learn anything. And I think what we're depriving our children at the moment is not so much a specific kind of history, because I think I can live it. I mean, I agree with you. I don't think there should be a national curriculum, and I wish there wasn't, because then my history could get, you know, a bit more time, you know, rest of them. But I don't think it's a good idea anyway. But I do think there should be a history that children have got to learn, and it could be, you know, in some schools you can give Christian history, other places they can give national history. I don't particularly care, as long as it's a solid body of historical material which they have to, you know, sort of think about. And I think that's because at least there's meaning and there's cause. There's something that they can embrace, they can take away, and rebel against. I mean, that's what young people do in the course of intellectual clarification. And I think that's what we should be doing. And I actually think that it's really important to criticize these things, because although they're irrational, they're also rational. They're rational in the sense that they correspond to a real cultural need. And a cultural need is that people are actually desperately searching for answers. I mean, we haven't stopped searching for answers at the moment. The trouble is that we find our answers, we're much more likely to find our answers in nature, amongst rocks, amongst molecules and atoms, than we do, you know, in terms of our own communities, our own families, and our own life. And that's why these kinds of debates are really useful.
Right, quite a few more people want to speak. First you? Yeah.
I very much agree with your thinking about big history. If you spend some time at night and turn news channels, you either see history like volcanoes and Big Bang, or you see history documentaries extended to the future. There's this series, Planet Earth Without Humans, and they can tell you how many thousand years it takes for the Statue of Liberty to finally collapse without man keeping it. But so I very much agree with that. But you said, okay, so we should focus on criticizing that. Do you say that criticizing the opposite, small history, is less important? Because in Germany, if you look at history documentaries, what you learn is the kind of food that Adolf Hitler liked and the kind of women
he was fancying, and particularly the color of the shoes and whatever. So you also have that small history that completely takes you off anything you can possibly criticize. And I would say that both are basically two sides of the same coin, really. Because how could you criticize a documentary telling you what food Hitler liked? There's also nothing to rebel against. So not really, apart from his bad taste, probably. But this is about it. So I would say, isn't it that you have to, that we actually have to argue that both these trends are trends away from human agency, and we should criticize them in the same way.
Okay, James at the back.
Briefly, the First World War is coming back, as we know, and I think we should alert ourselves to two things. First of all, the local personal dimension, the Sassoonian dimension, is still very much around, but the Times and I believe the Telegraph are saying that we must celebrate this as a victory against the Germans, which is rather interesting. I wonder whether you want to come back on that, Frank, because it's an attempt, I suppose, at a big history and even some causality, really, or some sort of narrative. But I think they're getting into slippery stuff. Just for reference, folks, We Are Stardust, Joni Mitchell, 1969. So I think that's an important historiographic event. Briefly, about the future. Forecasting has a relationship with history. It might be a dubious enterprise, but I think you should know that the main event in forecasting now is Moore's Law. So instead of the naturalization, it's a kind of IT naturalization, which says Moore's Law says you can pack more transistors on a chip, double the number of transistors every year, or maybe 18 months. It may run out one day, but we're inexorably moving to faster innovation and all of this stuff, even though the evidence in many sectors shows that this is not the case. So I think there you have a sort of naturalization of the future. And by the way, Stuart Brand, who's the sort of Democratic Party version of Bill Gates, has a future project called The Long Now, which is looking millions of years ahead. So there you have the forecasting version of the back to the Big Bang history, equally shallow.
Okay, Alex.
Yeah, I've been looking at the question of the globally in the case of the secondary, the school curriculum, and I've written a book about global learning. And I guess what I found, similar to what Frank is saying, that the idea of global obviously can have a geographic meaning, but it can also mean holistic and inclusivity. So, I found that when people are saying they should include everything, really what they're saying is they don't want to make a judgment. They don't want to make a judgment about which ideas, which knowledge is important, what values we should uphold. So it's it is a case of everything being equal. And so all that's left when you do that is the self. And so children are left to sort of figure it out for themselves, and not in a creative way, but in a sort of tolerate all different ideas. In my subject, geography, one of the things that's going on, when this comes to what you're ending with, environmental history, we're increasingly seeing people argue that you shouldn't have physical geography as separate from human geography, that the two should be merged, and they argue that because they say that human beings have become so influential in the world that now we're more important than nature. We're a driving force that is affecting nature in such a larger way. You see expression of this in the idea of the Anthropocene. You've heard of this. The Anthropocene has been put forward for a couple of years now as a new geological period. Okay, so and most people sort of equate that with the Industrial Revolution. So they're saying that we human beings are on equivalent with the ending of the dinosaurs or a new glacial period. So I guess the other side of that is the elevation of our role in relation to the environment, and us as sort of putting us in that story of the unfolding of the environment.
Yes, I've heard of all that stuff as well. Fascinating.
I suppose it's paralleling that development away from sort of national history and the international, and paralleling with big history, this global governance, and how that's sort of shifted from the 1990s. Because what sort of, human rights is out. Actually, it's now resilience is the big thing, and the striking thing in international relations as a discipline is it's sort of, on one hand, it's sort of fragmentation into specialist areas, but it's going to geography, the cutting edge IR. It's going geographical, and you have that whole sort of shift away from humanitarianism and that sort of humanitarian intervention towards resilience, resilience governance, and the whole protection of the biosphere, and a sort of post-human humanitarianism, if you like. One thing that's really striking about that, the metaphors of the sort of or the discussion of volcanoes and earthquakes. As you look historically, you've got people like C.L.R. James, or the people in the English Civil War, where you've got that identification with earthquakes and volcanoes as a metaphor of revolution. But now you've got sort of humans coming out of the indication of the natural world.
Okay. Just on Alex's point, it's kind of an interesting one because the anthropocene, what that's really about, it seems to be placing human beings at the center, but it's actually a big attack on human beings because it's criticizing the effect on the environment of the anthropocene. So I'd love to ask a question about why you have a child called Bruno and a dog called Bruno. And a cat called Kevin. We'll leave
If I was giving a lecture on Nietzsche, I'd probably say it because I'm a repressed homosexual. But, so this is not a discussion of Nietzsche. So I think that on this whole point about sort of man being at the center of the environment, there's an interesting double standard there because the argument is that human beings have this incredible impact on the environment. And they've got this incredible capacity to destroy and to alter things for the worse. So, there's an incredible power there. For some reason, when it comes to human relationships, when it comes to doing things within society and the communities, the same human beings who are so omnipotent in their nature are distinctly feeble about doing stuff in the domain of the human. It's an interesting contradiction. And the way that manifests itself, periodically you will hear somebody saying, well, we can develop this technology to solve this and that problem. And people will say, but there is no technological fix to this. There's something wrong with looking for a solution. And what they really mean by that is that the reason why that is wrong, it's kind of morally wrong, because we should be, sort of seeing ourselves in a resigned way. To those other kind of questions. So there's an interesting kind of double standard that kind of runs all the way through here. The reason why I'm not that interested in local history, I have written about local history in the past, when it first emerged. The reason why I'm not that interested in it, I'm still obviously quite interested in that, is because in many respects, when you're looking at the new sort of kind of local histories that are being written, you'll find that the local histories do in a microscopic kind of a way what the big histories are doing more broadly. And it's interesting that there's a whole new breed of local histories, which are really almost about, the natural history of a particular town. It's really about the physical, non-cultural kind of dimension of that. So even local history is changing along these kinds of lines. And I think although there are these, sort of curious local kind of stories still in existence, the future of history is very much moving in that direction. And somebody was talking about geography and how important geography is. I think most of you will know, especially those of you that have been in school in the last 10 years, that geography is no longer about geography. There was a time, call me old-fashioned, but in my geography, I had to know about rivers, their names, their kind of how many nations they kind of cross, transportation systems, capital cities, oil production, gold production, sort of all that kind of stuff. You look at the geographical curriculum now, and it's very, very naturalistic. Right? But the funny thing is that when you go to university to do a PhD in geography, then what happens is that then geography takes over everything else. And everything that used to be done in psychology, sociology, history, whatever, geography and culture, geography has seamlessly expanded into that. And that's why today, in many, many parts of the world, all the important social commentators or cultural commentators, have become geographers. They feel that because geography has become a discipline without limits. It's a completely unlimited discipline. It's a fantastic, sort of. And when you talk to geographers, you say, hey, you're not looking at everything. Isn't that fantastic, Frank? We got this discipline that can look at anything. And literally everything becomes geography. It shows you the way in which these trends that we're discussing are replicated within the university curriculum itself.
Okay, another round of questions. Penny?
What's the origin of the big history discussion? Where does it begin?
Right, excellent, nice short question. Kevin? Not the cat.
I mean, it doesn't surprise me, just to pick up a really small angle of this, it doesn't surprise me that historians have a problem with causality and trying to provide meaning. So let me give you two examples. Next year's 100th anniversary of the First World War, 2014. 2016 is the 100th anniversary of the Easter Rising back in Ireland. And if you see, I totally disagree with your take on those two newspaper editorials you're talking about how the Times and Telegraph said we want to say we beat the Germans. Because what I'm reading in all the journals, newspapers, articles is the fact that historians have a duty to promote reconciliation, and we have a duty to avoid the blame game. And it works itself out in lots of different ways in both Ireland and Britain, but all these contentious anniversaries and commemorations are coming up, so you have a duty. And what starts to happen is the historian becomes estranged from their discipline as they have to feed into this wider narrative that's at play. The interesting thing is that people argue that you have a duty and responsibility. They think they're well-meaning, they think they're well-intentioned, but what they actually do is they rob the subject of history. They remove the human agency from our being the First World War, and sometimes you can say that someone was to blame. And of course, in Irish, Civil War, War of Independence, of course, someone was to blame, and that was the Brits. But now you can't say it. I mean, effectively, you cannot say it under the guise of reconciliation. I know it's not the big history point they're making, but I think it actually feeds in the same sort of thrust that Frank is getting at.
Yeah, it's almost like they have a duty to not emphasize any history. That's Kerry.
It maybe relates to that, but one of the things from the readings you gave us, Frank, and the books as well as the extra readings was it's obvious how popular people like Jared Diamond and all that have now become, and frightening for me the extent to which prehistory and history is now entirely collapsed into this. And I think that's the point you're making about the very notion of history actually changes if man is removed in terms of prehistory, for example. But where does that fit with the instrumentalisation agenda and the way that, just me, because you almost feel that it's, other than the self-esteem stuff and with all the general outcome stuff, which is almost your point, Kevin, if that is what is happening, how are they then able to use history, or can't they anymore? Is it just about our behaviour change or population control? Or, do you know what I mean? It's kind of lost its capacity to provide use in the crude way in which education is used.
Okay, at the very back.
Yes, isn't there a problem here with a sort of merging together of science and history in a way that perhaps shouldn't be done? Because I was interested in what you were saying about the big history, about how they begin with the Big Bang and talk about quarks and things, but those are, of course, just models, just scientific models that shouldn't be applied in the same way as other historical phenomena, because I mean they should be explored in the context of science, where you can see how those models have changed over time and might change in the future. You can't treat them as historical facts, things like quarks. And but at the same time, is not this environmental history, isn't there a place for that? Perhaps not in history, but perhaps in terms of science, where we're looking at humanity as a species and just objectively saying, how have we, on a planet-wide scale, how have we interacted with the environment in which we found ourselves as a species? And isn't that still something very interesting to look at, whether or not you've got a historical agenda connected to it? And I mean, it can also have meaning for us to look at other civilizations in the past, surely, as environmental history does, and learn from the ways in which they have interacted with their environments and how different cultures have responded to their environments. And sometimes, you know, I mean, to defend Clive Poynting's book to some extent, it is illustrative of how different societies have, like the Easter Islanders, have overstepped the ability they have to survive on their resources and thus suffer disastrous consequences. Isn't that still something interesting to study?
Thanks for that. Well, I think you raise a very interesting point, and you're absolutely right that the relationship between humanity and the species and their environment should be a subject of study. But the subject of study should be under the label of natural history, which is what it used to be. So there is a fairly robust corpus of books on that subject, including the theory of evolution. You know, so I mean, all these things have looked at the environmental, the biological, the geological, and their relationship with the species that are here. And that's really important, but that's not history. That's not history. I think that's the important point. Now, you raised some interesting examples. See, when you look at the last 300 years, then we can look at phenomena. You mentioned the Easter Islands. You know. When I first started studying about the Easter Islands, the narrative that I learned was, isn't this incredible? I mean, these people on that island somehow managed to build this incredible statue. You know, how did they ever manage to do that? How did they have the wherewithal, the imagination, the equipment, you know, to put that together? That's the story that we learned. Now you might say, well, that's a bit one-sided, we don't know, blah, blah, blah. That's fine. But anyway, that's what I remember as a kid, being absolutely fascinated by the Easter Island. You know, and I wanted to go there, and I wanted to see what was really going on there. Today we learn a depraved story of human arrogance, you know, of humanity overreaching itself. And how many times do you hear the expression, humanity overreaching itself? And instead of celebrating what is an incredible episode that we know very, very little about, instead of celebrating that, we turn this into a medieval moral maxim that we should kind of whip ourselves over how terrible things are. And what I'm really trying to get at is that when we pick and choose nature and bring it into history, we don't just simply do it neutrally, we tell a story. And it's always been like that. So in the 19th century, whenever people relied on nature as a way of explaining causes instead of society, always, without exception, it had a thoroughly reactionary and very dangerous consequence. So, for example, if you take social Darwinism, the social Darwinism and sociobiology in the 19th century, you know, sort of carried on the evolutionary process, but then brought that into society, and we learned that the reason why white people were like this and black people were like that, and why you had this hierarchy of human beings, was really just an extension of what happened within nature itself. Because, in other words, rather than understanding the relationship between Africans and Europeans, between different kinds of cultures and different nations, the biology was used as a way of making sense of that. And ever since that time, whenever we've been called for an answer, and we kind of look at sociobiology to give us what are cultural and social kind of moral kind of answers, we've always naturalized, you know, and human relations. And whenever we naturalize human relations, we always end up with extremely regressive, anti-human kind of consequences. That's really, you know, sort of my concern why I'm really kind of worried about it. And I think we should, sort of to some extent, bear that in mind. Somebody asked a question about complexity, about why now, and what's really driving it. And I think it's important to understand that people have opted for big history, not because they're bad people, or because they're decided that let's use big history as a way of fooling individuals. It's not a conscious process like that. Whenever people are drawn towards certain explanations, there's something in their lives, something in their experience that disposes them towards those kinds of answers. And I think the reason why we've opted for, well, not I or we, but some people opted for big history, is because we live in a world, and I think this has been one of the interesting issues in the last 25, 30 years, where uncertainty has become very difficult for us to handle. And we really are very bad at engaging with uncertainty, and in particular, as a result of that, we fetishize complexity. I mean, how many times do you hear the word, oh, it's so complex? I mean, if you're a student at university, in the social sciences, the number of times you're told, this is a very kind of complex issue, and there's no, and complexity then becomes allied to this other argument that we live in a complex world. It's a world where everything is interrelated. And that sounds very, very nice. I mean, gosh, everything is interrelated, right? Everything is totally interrelated. It's a globalized world, and therefore there are no boundaries anymore. And you get this sense of these enmeshed networks where everything is, and it sounds like these guys are so subtle, they're so knowledgeable, they can link everything up to everything else. But of course, the more you emphasize the links and complexities and the way they are, the less you actually explain anything specific. I mean, how can you explain something that has a cause to it, but everything is so related to each other? I mean, the way that complexity is used becomes really a way that we actually evade, providing an answer. And you might argue, well, of course, there are no simple answers, and there aren't any simple answers. And I'm happy to say that I often get things really, really wrong. Right? All of us get stuff really, really wrong. But at the very least, in the pursuit of finding an answer, I'm not just simply saying everything is connected, man, and everything is a big universe. In the very process of looking for some kind of a truth, even if our answers are one-sided, even if they're limited, even if they're subject to modification, we kind of move towards greater clarity. And I would far rather that I came up with a really wrong answer in the course of a debate than basically said, this is just too complex. I'm really not going to bother to give you anything other than tell you how complex and interrelated the world is, because at least by coming up with a wrong answer, you invite a reaction, you invite a response, you create the basis for a debate, you kind of create a situation that can put in place a process of where clarity can be crystallized to the point at which we kind of move forward. So I do think that that's really what's driving big history. And it's the spirit of our time. It's a zeitgeist response rather than anything that any individual that's simply dreamt up.
Right. Sorry, I'm afraid that's all the questions.